Before I tell you what happened after my sister raised her glass and called me broke at her own wedding, tell me this. What time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? I'm curious how far this story travels. Because what happened next didn't just ruin a wedding. It exposed a $58 million lie. My name is Mara Bennett. I'm 34 years old. And the moment Vanessa lifted that champagne flute, I already knew she had been waiting all night to do it. You know the kind of moment I mean. The room goes just a little too quiet. People smile just a little too hard. Everyone senses something uncomfortable is about to happen, but no one says anything, because they want to watch. The ballroom looked perfect. Soft gold lighting, white roses arranged in tall glass vases, a string quartet playing just loud enough to make everything feel expensive. Vanessa stood at the center of it all in her custom gown, flawless as always. She tapped her glass lightly, smiled that polished smile, and turned toward me. To my sister, she said, her voice light, effortless. The one who always shows up looking modest. Careful, almost like she's afraid of money. But we love her anyway, don't we? A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that's what people do when cruelty wears confidence. I didn't react right away. I picked up my glass slowly and stood. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then I looked straight at her. Then let's raise one, I said, calm, steady. For the woman who borrows from the person she mocks, lies about it, and still expects applause. The room froze. Completely. Her smile didn't disappear immediately. That's the thing about Vanessa. She trained her face better than her instincts. But I saw it. The flicker. The panic underneath the polish. Mara, she laughed softly, adjusting her grip on the glass. Are we really doing this? Here. Her tone was gentle, but the message was clear. I was the problem. Not her. Not the insult. Not the years behind it. That had always been the pattern. She cuts. I bleed. And then everyone asks why I'm making a scene. But tonight was different. 3,000 in February, I said, still holding her gaze. 900 in April. 1,500 in June when rent was due and you didn't want Liam to know. The laughter died completely. Somewhere behind me, a chair shifted. Someone whispered. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her glass. You don't need to say numbers. Yes, I said quietly. You didn't need to make a speech either. That's when Liam stepped closer. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough to show that something had shifted. What is she talking about? He asked. Vanessa didn't answer. And that silence? That was louder than anything I could have said. I should have stopped there. Honestly, that would have been enough to ruin the night. But I didn't stop. Because this was never just about a few $1,000s. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. Not to wave it around. Not to perform. Just to check something I had already been watching all evening. The time. 8:42 p.m. I looked back at Vanessa. Keep smiling, I said softly. She blinked. You have about 3 minutes left. For a second, she actually looked confused. Not angry. Not defensive. Just confused. Like she had walked into a room where the rules had changed without her noticing. Then Liam's phone buzzed. Once. Twice. He glanced down, frowning. His expression shifted almost instantly. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something colder. What is this? He muttered. Vanessa turned toward him too quickly. Ignore it. It's not probably anything, he cut in. Around us, people were starting to murmur. The music had stopped. I don't even remember when. The entire room had narrowed to a single moment. One that had been building for much longer than anyone there realized. I checked the time again. 8:45 p.m. Right on schedule. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to pull every eye in the room toward them. 2 men stepped in first. Suits. Calm. Controlled. The kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. Then more followed. Badges flashed. Voices low but firm. Vanessa Bennett? Everything stopped. Her hand finally shook. The champagne glass slipped just slightly in her grip, catching the light before she steadied it. Yes, she said, but it came out thinner than she intended. We're going to need you to come with us. A ripple moved through the crowd. Shock. Confusion. Someone gasped. Liam took a step back. What is this? He demanded. The agent didn't look at him. His attention stayed on her. At 8:45 p.m., he said calmly, all associated accounts under investigation have been frozen. Another agent added, just as evenly. Total exposure, $58 million. This time, The silence wasn't awkward. It was absolute. Vanessa turned toward me, slowly, like she already knew the answer but needed to see it anyway. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control of the story. I held her gaze, and I didn't say a word. My name is Mara Bennett. I am 34 years old, and if you had met me before that night, you probably would have described me as reliable. Not impressive, not flashy, just the person who always had things handled before anyone else realized there was a problem. I was the one people called when something went wrong with paperwork, with accounts, with details they did not understand. I worked in document restoration and financial record verification for a state-affiliated archive, which meant I spent my days reconstructing damaged records, tracing inconsistencies, and proving what was real and what had been altered. It is a quiet job. It does not look important from the outside. But when something is missing, when numbers do not add up, when a signature is not what it should be, people like me are the ones who find out. I did not always live this carefully. There was a time when I trusted people without checking everything twice. That version of me ended 2 years ago, when I discovered that the man I was engaged to had opened a line of credit in both of our names without telling me. He assumed I would fix it. He assumed I would absorb the damage because I was the responsible one. And for a short time, I almost did. That is the thing about being dependable. People start to believe your limits do not exist. I canceled the wedding. I spent months rebuilding my credit, my savings, and something far more difficult to repair, which was my judgment. From that point on, I documented everything. Every transfer, every message, every promise. Not because I expected betrayal from everyone, but because I had learned how easily reality could be rewritten when no one kept records. Vanessa used to joke about that. She would say I lived like an accountant trapped in a museum, always preserving things that no one else cared about. But she also knew exactly what I was capable of. She knew I paid attention. She knew I noticed patterns. And that is why, looking back now, I understand that none of what happened was accidental. My relationship with Vanessa had always been uneven, even before the money. She was the one people noticed first. The one who walked into a room and made it feel like something important had just arrived. She dressed well, spoke confidently, and knew how to make people feel included just long enough to keep their attention. I was the opposite. I blended in. I listened more than I spoke. I fixed things quietly. For years, that balance seemed harmless. She shined, I supported, and our parents treated it like a natural arrangement rather than a choice they were reinforcing. But small things started to shift about 4 years ago. At first, it was just questions. Casual ones. She would ask about how I managed my accounts, what banks I used, how I tracked expenses, whether I ever worried about fraud. It sounded like curiosity, the kind people express when they want to be more organized. Then it became requests. Small amounts of money. Temporary, she said. Always temporary. There was always a reason that sounded reasonable in isolation. A delayed payment. A timing issue. A situation she did not want to explain in front of someone else. I helped her. Of course I did. That is what I had always done. But I also recorded it. Not because I thought she would refuse to pay me back, but because I had learned that memory is not a reliable system when emotions get involved. At the time, I believed I was being cautious. What I did not realize was that I was documenting the early stages of something much larger. The first moment I felt something was off did not come from the money itself. It came from how she talked about it afterward. She would joke about being bad with numbers in front of other people, then privately ask me for exact figures again, as if she needed to confirm something. She would downplay what she owed, then reference details she should not have remembered if she truly was careless. It was subtle, not enough to accuse, just enough to notice. Then there were the conversations where she began to reframe me. In front of family, she would describe me as overly cautious, almost afraid of spending. She would mention my older car, my practical clothes, my routines, and present them as evidence that I was struggling financially, even though the reality was the opposite. I was stable because I chose to be. But the narrative she built made it seem like stability was failure. At first, I thought it was insecurity, that she needed to elevate herself by lowering me. That is common in families where attention is limited and roles are fixed early. I told myself it was not intentional harm, just immaturity. And because I told myself that, I kept helping her. I kept answering her calls. I kept transferring money when she asked. What I did not understand yet was that she was not just borrowing resources. She was studying them. Every question about my accounts. Every conversation about how I structured my finances. Every moment I explained something because she wanted to learn. It was all information. And information, in the wrong hands, becomes access. By the time I started to feel uneasy enough to review everything in detail, the pattern was already established. Transfers that lined up too precisely with other movements. Requests that came just before something else changed. Small discrepancies that could be dismissed individually, but not when viewed together. And the most important detail of all was this. None of it required force. None of it required hacking or breaking in. It worked because I trusted her enough to open the door myself. That is the part people misunderstand about situations like this. They imagine a dramatic moment where everything is taken. In reality, it happens slowly, quietly, one conversation at a time, one favor at a time, until the line between helping someone and being used by them disappears completely. Standing in that ballroom, watching federal agents move toward my sister while guests tried to understand what they were seeing, I was not shocked. Not in the way everyone else was. I had already seen the structure. I had already followed the trail. What they were witnessing was not the beginning of the story. It was the point where everything that had been hidden finally became visible. And the hardest part to accept was not that Vanessa had done it. It was how long it had taken me to realize that she had never needed to take anything by force, because I had been giving her access all along. If you had asked me back then to describe my sister, I would not have called her dangerous. I would have said she was charming, organized when she wanted to be, a little impulsive with money, but nothing unusual. That is how it always starts. People like Vanessa do not look like a problem. They look like someone who just needs a little help. After I rebuilt my life, I became more careful, but I did not become distant from my family. That was my mistake. I believed I could set boundaries and still keep the same level of access. I thought awareness alone was enough protection. It is not. Vanessa began showing up more often, not just at family gatherings, but in my daily routines. She would stop by after work, bring coffee, sit at my kitchen table, and ask questions that sounded harmless. What software I used to track accounts, how I organized documents, whether I kept physical copies or digital backups. At the time, it felt like interest. Now I know it was mapping. She also started adjusting how she presented herself around me. Less confident, more vulnerable. She talked about pressure, about keeping up appearances, about how expensive everything had become. She framed herself as someone overwhelmed, not irresponsible. And when people feel overwhelmed, you help them. You do not interrogate them. The first request after that shift was small. A transfer to cover a delay, then another for a car repair, then rent. Always with an explanation that sounded temporary. Always with the promise that it would not happen again. I kept records, but I did not escalate. I told myself I was just being organized. At the same time, something else started to change. Small inconsistencies began to appear in places that had nothing to do with her requests. A login notification I did not recognize. A password reset email I had not triggered. A delay in a transfer confirmation that usually processed instantly. Each one was easy to dismiss on its own. Systems fail sometimes. Emails get delayed. People mistype. But patterns do not happen by accident. I began reviewing my accounts more closely. Not in panic, just in routine. I checked timestamps, cross-referenced transactions, compared them to my own records. Everything still balanced. That was the unsettling part. If something was wrong, it was being done carefully enough to remain invisible at a surface level. Around the same time, Vanessa started introducing a new element into conversations. She would question my memory. Not directly, indirectly. She would reference things I supposedly said or decisions I supposedly made that I did not recall. When I corrected her, she would laugh it off. Say I was overworked. Say I needed to relax. Then she brought up a doctor. Prescott. She said he had helped a friend manage stress and cognitive overload. She suggested I talk to him. Not because anything was wrong, just to stay ahead of it. That phrase stayed with me. Stay ahead of what? I agreed to one appointment. Not because I believed I needed it, but because I wanted to remove the argument. Prescott was calm, measured, and professional. He asked standard questions. Sleep patterns, workload, memory. Nothing overtly concerning. But there was something about the way he framed things. Subtle suggestions that fatigue could affect recall, that stress could create gaps, that high-functioning individuals sometimes did not notice early signs of decline. He never diagnosed anything. He did not need to. He planted doubt. After that, Vanessa used those ideas in conversation. If I questioned a detail, she would remind me of what the doctor said. If I insisted on a fact, she would suggest I might be misremembering. It was not aggressive. It was controlled. Just enough to make me pause before pushing back. That is how gaslighting works when it is done well. It does not try to convince you that you are wrong all at once. It teaches you to question yourself before you question anyone else. Meanwhile, access continued to expand. I noticed that she had become very familiar with my routines. When I checked accounts, when I updated records, when I was likely to be busy, she did not ask those questions directly anymore. She already knew the answers. The turning point did not come from a single discovery. It came from a missing document. A simple one. A printed confirmation I always kept in a specific folder. It was not there. I checked again. Then I checked the digital copy. Still there. The record existed, but the physical proof was gone. I asked Vanessa about it casually, because she had been at my place the day before. She did not deny touching anything. She just smiled and said she might have moved a few papers while cleaning up. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that I should not stress about small details like that. That response told me more than the missing document ever could. People who make mistakes usually try to correct them. People who are hiding something try to minimize its importance. From that point on, I stopped assuming anything was accidental. I did not confront her. I did not accuse. I adjusted. I tightened access. I changed how I stored information. I created duplicate records that only I knew about. And I started tracking not just transactions, but behavior, timing, frequency, patterns of contact. What I found was not obvious. There were no large withdrawals, no direct transfers that could not be explained. But there were links, small connections between accounts that should not have been connected, movements that lined up too precisely with moments when I was distracted or unavailable. And Vanessa was always nearby when those moments happened. By then, I understood one thing clearly. She was not improvising. She was following a structure. The only question left was who built it. Once I stopped assuming things were accidental, everything became easier to see. Not obvious, not dramatic, just clearer. Patterns that used to feel like noise started lining up. And the more I looked, the more consistent those patterns became. Vanessa did not push harder after that. She adjusted. That is what made it dangerous. When someone senses resistance, they either escalate or they adapt. She adapted. She became more careful with requests. Less frequent. More reasonable. She spaced them out. Changed the context. Sometimes weeks would pass without anything unusual, just long enough to reset my expectations. Then something small would happen again. A transfer I did not remember scheduling would appear as pending before disappearing. Not completed. Not failed. Just gone. A notification would arrive late, time-stamped earlier than when I actually received it. A login alert would show a location that was technically possible, but not mine. Each instance could be explained on its own. Systems glitch. Networks lag. But systems do not glitch in patterns that align with a single person's proximity. At the same time, Vanessa continued shaping how other people saw me. In front of family, she leaned into the same narrative. That I was overly cautious. That I worried too much. That I tracked things no one else cared about. It sounded harmless, even affectionate, but it had a purpose. If I ever raised a concern, it would already be framed as an overreaction. My parents reinforced it without realizing. My mother would say I needed to relax more. My father would remind me that not everything required analysis. They were not trying to dismiss me. They thought they were balancing me. But what they were actually doing was lowering the credibility of anything I might say later. That is how control works when it is layered. You do not just influence the target. You influence the audience around the target. Prescott remained part of that structure. I did not go back for a second appointment, but his language stayed in circulation. Vanessa would reference him casually, as if his opinions were established facts. She would mention cognitive fatigue or stress-related memory gaps in conversations that had nothing to do with health. It created a quiet permission for people to doubt me without feeling like they were being unfair. I started testing small things, not confrontations, controls. I changed one password and monitored whether any access attempts followed. They did. Not immediately, not directly linked to her device, but timed within a window that matched when she had been at my place earlier that day. I altered the way I labeled certain records, creating versions that looked identical unless you knew what to check. Within a week, One of those versions appeared referenced in a context where it should not have existed at all. That meant someone had seen it. Not guessed. Seen it. None of this was enough to act on legally. Not yet. But it was enough to confirm that I was no longer dealing with coincidence. The most important shift happened internally. I stopped thinking of Vanessa as someone making poor decisions. I started thinking of her as someone executing a process. That change affects how you respond. You stop reacting emotionally. You start observing strategically. I also stopped correcting her in public. When she made comments about me being forgetful or overly cautious, I let them pass. Not because I agreed, but because contradicting them would only reinforce the narrative she was building. Instead, I focused on gathering information. Every interaction became data. Timing of her calls, topics she brought up, questions she repeated in different forms. Even the way she phrased things when she thought I was not paying attention. One pattern stood out more than the others. She was not just interested in my finances. She was interested in how my systems connected to other systems. Were my accounts linked? What institutions I used? How identity verification worked in different contexts? That is not curiosity. That is infrastructure. Around that time, I noticed a new name appearing in connection with some of the irregular activity. Not directly tied to me. Not in any obvious way. But present in the background of certain transactions and corporate references. Crestline. It appeared once, then again, then disappeared behind layers that made it difficult to trace casually. I did not mention it to anyone, not even to myself out loud. Naming something too early can distort how you interpret it. Instead, I documented it. Dates, context, where it appeared, where it did not. Vanessa's behavior did not change in any visible way during this period. She still attended family gatherings, still joked, still presented herself as someone who occasionally needed help but was otherwise in control of her life. If anything, she seemed more relaxed. That was the part that confirmed it for me. People who are struggling look tense. People who are executing a plan look calm. The final confirmation came from something that, on the surface, had nothing to do with money. It was a message. A simple one. Vanessa texted me asking if I could resend a document I had already given her weeks earlier. She specified a detail about it that I had never included in any version I shared with her. That meant she had seen a version she was not supposed to see. I did not question her. I resent the document. A controlled version. And I waited. 2 days later, that same detail appeared referenced in a context tied to Crestline. Not directly, not obviously, but enough. Enough to connect the two. At that point, the situation stopped being about personal boundaries. It became something else entirely. Something that required more than documentation, more than observation. I was not just being used. I was being integrated into a system that I did not build, but that had been designed to run through me. And once I understood that, the next step was not confrontation. It was escalation. I did not confront Vanessa after that. Not because I was unsure, but because I was certain. And certainty changes the way you act. When you are unsure, you ask questions. When you are certain, you start building a case. Up until that point, everything I had found was pattern-based. Strong, consistent, but still indirect. Enough to know something was wrong, not enough to prove what it was. That is the gap people underestimate. Suspicion feels like truth, but it does not hold up on its own. I needed something concrete. Something that could not be explained away as coincidence, error, or stress. So I stopped looking at what was missing, and I started looking at what was moving. I went back through my records, not just the obvious ones. Not just my main accounts or recent transfers. Everything. Archived statements. Old confirmations. Metadata most people never check. I compared timestamps across systems that were not supposed to interact. Banking logs, email routing, document access history. That is when the structure started to show. There were transfers that did not originate from my primary interface, but still carried my authorization signature. Not forged. Not altered. Real. That meant the access point was legitimate. The system believed it was me. There were linked accounts that had been added quietly, not as direct connections, but through secondary authorization layers. The kind used for business integrations or third-party processing. The kind most individuals never set up unless they have a reason. I never set them up. And then there were the amounts. Not large. That is what made them effective. Small enough to avoid alerts. Spaced out enough to avoid patterns at a glance. But when aggregated over time, they formed something else entirely. A flow. Not random. Directed. Every path led outward, away from my accounts, through intermediaries, into structures that were deliberately difficult to trace. And every time I followed one of those paths far enough, I found the same name appearing in different forms. Crestline. At that point, I stopped treating it as a coincidence and started treating it as an entity. I cross-referenced public records, corporate filings, anything that could be accessed without raising attention. Crestline existed, but not in a way that made sense. It appeared in multiple states, under slightly different variations, each one thin. Minimal documentation, minimal footprint. Enough to exist, not enough to be understood. That is not how legitimate businesses operate. That is how cover structures operate. The connection back to me was still indirect. Nothing tied my name to Crestline in any official way. But the pathways between my accounts and those structures were real. And they had been built using access that only someone close to me could have had. Vanessa. But even then, something did not fit. She had access. She had opportunity. But she did not have the discipline required to build something this consistent over time. This was not impulsive behavior. It was controlled, repetitive, designed to avoid detection, which meant she was not the origin. She was the entry point. That realization changed the scope completely. This was no longer about recovering money or setting boundaries. It was about understanding the full system before it expanded further. I made one decision at that point that defined everything that followed. I did not shut it down. That sounds counterintuitive, but shutting it down too early would have ended the flow before I understood where it led. It would have protected what remained, but it would not have exposed the structure. And if there was a structure, then there were more than just my accounts involved. So instead, I contained it. I isolated the accounts that were being accessed. I created parallel tracking outside of the systems being used. I set alerts that only I could see, and I let the activity continue under controlled observation. Within days, the pattern expanded. Not dramatically, but enough. I saw new connections forming, new endpoints. And then, for the first time, I saw a direct interaction that did not involve Vanessa at all. A transfer request initiated from an external node, routed through one of the linked layers, approved automatically under my credentials, and directed toward a Crestline-associated account. That meant the system could operate without her being present. She was not managing it in real time. She had enabled it. And that meant there was someone else controlling the execution. I sat with that for a long time. Not because I was confused, but because I was aligning it with something I had not wanted to revisit. 2 years earlier, when I ended my engagement, it was not just because of the credit line. It was because of how it had been done. Quietly, strategically, without immediate detection. The same patterns I was seeing now. At the time, I told myself it was a personal betrayal, a relationship issue, something contained to that situation. I was wrong. The methods were identical. The pacing, the structure, the way access was built slowly instead of taken all at once. That is when I understood what I was actually looking at. This was not a new system. It was a reused one. And Vanessa had not created it. She had been placed into it. That realization did not make me angry. It made me focused. Because once you know you are inside a system, you stop trying to fix individual problems and start planning how to dismantle the entire thing. I closed my laptop, documented everything I had found, and for the first time, I allowed myself to say it clearly. This was not family conflict. This was fraud, and I was not going to confront it alone. I did not call Vanessa after that. I did not confront my parents. I did not warn anyone. When you understand that you are dealing with a system instead of a situation, the first rule is simple. Do not alert the system that you see it. The next morning, I did something that would have seemed excessive to anyone who did not know what I knew. I contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in financial fraud and asset tracing. I did not give him a story. I gave him data, transaction logs, timestamps, access records, and a structured summary of everything I had observed. No speculation, just facts. He did not interrupt while I explained. He did not react immediately when I finished. He read through the documents twice before saying anything. That was the first confirmation I needed. People who understand this kind of situation do not respond quickly. They respond carefully. His first question was not about Vanessa. It was about scope. How many accounts? How long the activity had been occurring? Whether there were any indicators of external control. Those are not questions you ask if you think this is a family dispute. Those are questions you ask when you are assessing a network. His second question was whether I had taken any action to stop it. I told him no. I told him I had contained it and continued observing. He nodded once. That was the second confirmation. You did the right thing, he said. If this is what it looks like, shutting it down too early would have protected you, but it would have buried everything else. That was the moment the situation shifted from something I was managing to something being handled. Not solved, not resolved, just moved into a different level of response. He advised me to stop interacting with the compromised systems directly, not to shut them off, but to avoid creating new activity that could interfere with the pattern. He set up a secure channel for communication and brought in a financial analyst who worked with him on cases like this. Someone who could follow money across layers that most systems treat as separate. Within 48 hours, they confirmed what I had suspected. The structure was not isolated. Crestline was not a single entity. It was a network of entities designed to move funds through multiple jurisdictions without triggering standard alerts. The amounts I had seen were small because my accounts were being used as feeder points, not storage. That meant the total exposure was not just what had moved through me. It was everything connected to the same pathways. The next step involved law enforcement. Not a general report, not a complaint, a targeted referral. My lawyer handled that. He did not ask me to make the call. He prepared the documentation in a format that would be taken seriously and passed it through the appropriate channel. I was not present for that conversation, but I saw the result of it. Within a day, I was contacted by 2 agents. They did not ask me to explain everything again. They already had the summary. They asked specific questions, clarifications, confirmation of timelines, whether anyone else in my immediate circle had access, whether I had noticed changes in behavior that aligned with the activity. They did not say Vanessa's name first. They let me say it. That is how they verify consistency. From that point forward, I was no longer just documenting. I was coordinating. They instructed me to maintain normal behavior. No confrontation. No sudden changes in routine. Continue interacting with Vanessa as I had been. That part required more control than anything else. It is easier to act when you are emotional. It is harder to remain neutral when you know exactly what someone is doing. I agreed. Not because I trusted them completely, but because the alternative was acting alone against something I already knew was structured beyond a single person. Over the next few days, I watched Vanessa more closely than I ever had before. Not as a sister, as a variable. Her calls, her timing, the way she phrased requests, even the way she paused when certain topics came up. Nothing about her behavior suggested urgency. That was important. It meant she did not know the system had been identified. She believed it was still operating normally. At the same time, the agents were tracking the external activity. They did not share everything with me, but they shared enough. Enough to confirm that the flows I had identified were part of a larger pattern that extended beyond my accounts. Other names, other entry points, similar structures. This was not a one-time operation. It was repeatable. The final piece of the plan came from them, not from me. Timing. They asked me if there was any upcoming event where all primary individuals would be present in one place. Somewhere public enough to justify coordination, but controlled enough to manage the environment. There was only one answer that made sense. The wedding. Vanessa had spent months planning it. Every detail controlled. Every guest selected. It was the one place where she expected everything to go exactly the way she wanted. That is why they chose it. Not for drama. Not for exposure. For containment. Multiple targets in a single location. Predictable timing. Limited movement. From that point on, everything I did had a purpose tied to that moment. I confirmed details with the agents. I provided access where needed. I adjusted my own schedule to align with theirs. And I waited. That is the part people do not see when they watch something like what happened that night. They see the moment of exposure, the interruption, the arrest. They do not see the days before it, the control required to act normal, the decision not to confront when you have every reason to, the understanding that reacting too early would cost more than it would protect. By the time I walked into that ballroom, nothing that happened was spontaneous. It had all been decided in advance. The only thing Vanessa did not know was that the story she had been controlling for years was about to end on a timeline she did not choose. Once the timing was set, everything became about precision. Not speed, not emotion, precision. Because at that point, a mistake would not just affect me. It would affect the entire case. The agents did not involve me in everything, but they gave me enough to understand the structure we were dealing with. Crestline was not a single company. It was a network of entities layered across multiple jurisdictions, each one thin, each one designed to look incomplete on its own. When you examined them separately, they did not raise immediate concern. When you mapped them together, they formed a system. My role was not to trace the entire network. My role was to remain the point of access without disrupting it. That meant continuing to behave exactly as I had before, answering messages, responding to requests, not questioning details that would normally trigger suspicion. That was harder than it sounds. Vanessa continued to interact with me as if nothing had changed. She asked for small things, clarifications, occasional assistance framed as convenience rather than necessity. Each request was controlled, measured. She never pushed too far in a single interaction. That was consistent with everything I had already seen. But now I understood the purpose behind it. Every time I responded, every time I confirmed a detail, it fed into the system she had access to. Not directly, not in a way that would be obvious, but enough to maintain the pathways that had already been established. The agents monitored the external activity during this period. They tracked movements that aligned with my interactions. Not one-to-one, but close enough to confirm correlation. When I responded to a message within a certain window, activity would follow. When I delayed, the pattern shifted. That told them two things. First, that my account was still being used as an entry point. Second, that whoever was controlling the system was relying on predictable behavior from me. That predictability became part of the strategy. They asked me to introduce controlled variation, small delays, minor changes in timing, nothing that would trigger concern, but enough to observe how the system adapted. It did not stop. It adjusted. That confirmed external control. A person, not an automated process. Around that time, they identified additional nodes connected to the same structure. Other individuals whose accounts showed similar patterns. Different locations. Different backgrounds. Same methodology. That was the confirmation that this was not isolated to my situation. Vanessa was one entry point among several. That information changed how I looked at her. Not as someone uniquely targeted, but as someone selected for a role. She had access to me. She had proximity. She had the ability to influence how I was perceived. That made her useful. The question of who was directing it was no longer theoretical. The agents shared a name with my lawyer, not directly with me. He chose to tell me anyway, because it was relevant to my decision-making. It was someone I already knew. Not closely, not recently, but enough. 2 years earlier, when I ended my engagement, I believed I had removed that person from my life completely. I changed accounts. I closed lines of credit. I rebuilt everything with new controls. What I did not account for was indirect access. If you cannot reach someone directly, you reach them through someone who can. Vanessa had become that connection. That realization did not change the plan, but it clarified the stakes. This was not just about exposure. It was about stopping a structure that had already proven it could adapt and re-enter through different points. The final phase before the wedding was about consolidation. The agents coordinated with financial institutions to prepare for a simultaneous freeze. Not partial, not gradual, simultaneous. The goal was to prevent any movement once the action started. If even one pathway remained open, funds could be shifted beyond reach in seconds. They also prepared warrants based on the evidence gathered, not just for Vanessa, for anyone directly connected. To the execution layer, timing those actions required precision down to the minute. My involvement in that phase was minimal by design. I confirmed details when asked. I provided access where necessary, but I was not part of the operational decisions. That separation mattered. It protected the integrity of the case and ensured that nothing I did could be used to challenge the process later. In the days leading up to the wedding, Vanessa became more focused on the event itself. Details, guests, logistics. She spoke about it constantly. How everything had to be perfect. How everything had to look right. That focus worked in our favor. When someone is managing a major event, their attention narrows. They concentrate on what is visible. They assume everything behind the scenes is stable because it has been stable before. She had no reason to think otherwise. On the morning of the wedding, she called me. Not about money. Not about accounts. About seating arrangements. A minor issue with placement that she wanted my opinion on. I answered the same way I always did. Calm. Practical. Helpful. Do whatever keeps things simple, I told her. She laughed and said I always made things sound easier than they were. That was the last normal conversation we had. By the time I arrived at the venue, every piece of the plan was already in place. The agents were positioned. The financial triggers were set. The warrants were active, waiting for execution. From the outside, it looked like a wedding. Decorations, music, guests moving through the space. From the inside, it was something else entirely. All it needed was the moment to start. By the time the guests started arriving, everything was already in motion. Not visibly, not in a way anyone in that room could detect. But behind the scenes, the structure we had been tracking for days was now fully mapped. The agents had enough to act. The only thing left was to connect every active piece in real time and close it all at once. That is what people misunderstand about operations like this. They think the arrest is the main event. It is not. The main event is the moment when every pathway is identified and locked simultaneously. If that fails, everything else becomes irrelevant. I moved through the venue the same way I always did in public spaces. Quietly, observing without drawing attention. Vanessa was already there, surrounded by people, adjusting details, giving instructions, making sure everything aligned with the image she had built. From the outside, nothing about her behavior suggested risk. She looked exactly like someone in control. That was consistent with everything I had seen before. The agents were positioned throughout the venue, but they did not look like agents. That was intentional. They blended into the environment. Guests, staff, vendors. The kind of presence you do not register unless you are looking for it. I was not supposed to interact with them directly, but I knew where they were. Not exact positions, just enough to understand coverage. Entrances, exits, points where movement could be controlled without creating panic. At that point, my role was simple. Remain consistent. Do not trigger deviation. Vanessa approached me about 30 minutes before the ceremony. She was focused, composed, moving through her checklist. She asked if I had seen the final seating arrangement, if I thought the layout made sense. It was the same pattern as before. Use normal conversation to maintain normal conditions. I responded the same way I always had. Direct, practical, no emotion that would stand out. It works, I told her. No one is going to notice the difference. She smiled at that, not because of the content, but because it reinforced the role she expected me to play. The one who supports, the one who simplifies, the one who does not challenge. That consistency mattered more than anything I could have said. As the ceremony progressed, the agents continued monitoring activity. I did not see what they saw, but I understood what they were looking for. Active connections, live transactions, any attempt to move funds once certain triggers were introduced. The key detail was timing. Everything had to align. During the reception, Vanessa was fully in control of the room. She moved between tables, engaged with guests, maintained the image she had spent years building. If there was any awareness of risk, it did not show. That confirmed the final assumption. She did not know. Not about the scope, not about the structure, and definitely not about the timing. The moment they were waiting for was not random. It was selected based on behavior. A point where all primary individuals would be active, connected, and engaged. A point where any disruption would be visible immediately, but only after the system had already been locked. That moment was the toast. Public, central, predictable. When Vanessa stood up and took the microphone, everything aligned. Her focus shifted entirely to the room, to the audience, to the performance. That is when the agents moved. Not physically, not yet. They initiated the first phase remotely. Financial institutions received the trigger. Pre-authorized actions executed simultaneously. Accounts flagged. Access restricted. Transfers halted mid-process. The system did not shut down instantly. It resisted. There were attempts to reroute, to adjust. That was expected. But every pathway had already been identified. Every alternative had been prepared for. Within seconds, the movement stopped. That is when the second phase began. Notifications, not public, direct, sent to the devices connected to the active accounts. The people inside the system became aware at the same time. That is why Liam's phone reacted first. Not because he was the target, but because his access was active at that moment. From where I stood, I could see his expression change before anyone else understood what was happening. Confusion, then focus, then something else. Something closer to recognition. Vanessa noticed it too. Not immediately, but quickly enough to realize that something had shifted. Her attention moved from the room to him, then back to the audience, trying to maintain control of the moment. That is when the agents entered. Not rushing, not creating panic, just moving with purpose. The kind of movement that does not ask for attention, but receives it anyway. Everything after that looked sudden to everyone else. The interruption, the identification, the explanation. But the real event had already happened. The system was closed. The accounts were frozen. The structure had been exposed. And for the first time, Vanessa was standing in a room where control no longer belonged to her. From that point on, everything moved exactly the way it had been planned. Not rushed, not chaotic, controlled. People always imagine moments like this as loud. Shouting, panic, movement in every direction. That is not what happened. What actually happens when control shifts this quickly is something quieter. People stop. They look for context. They wait for someone to explain what they are seeing. Vanessa tried to take that role. She lowered the microphone, forced a smile, and turned toward the agents as if this were some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right tone. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. That line is almost automatic. It is what people say when they believe they still have room to negotiate the situation. The agent did not respond to the tone. He responded to the facts. "There is no mistake," he said. "We need you to step away from the stage." The room shifted again. Not physically, socially. The attention moved away from her and toward the agents. Authority replaced performance. Vanessa looked toward Liam. That was the first time I saw uncertainty that she could not control. Not panic. Not yet. Just a calculation that was not resolving the way she expected. Liam did not step in. He did not defend her. He did not interrupt. He looked down at his phone again, then back at her, as if trying to align what he was seeing on the screen with the person standing in front of him. "What did you do?" he asked. It was not loud, but in that moment, it carried further than anything she had said during the toast. Vanessa's response was delayed. That delay mattered more than the words that followed. "I didn't do anything," she said. But the structure of the situation had already changed. At that point, denial does not restore control. It only confirms that the person is no longer guiding the narrative. The second agent stepped forward and clarified the action. Not in detail, just enough to establish scope. At 8:45 p.m., all associated accounts connected to an ongoing investigation were frozen, he said. Total exposure currently identified is $58 million. That number did what the interruption alone could not. It reframed the entire event. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was not a personal issue. It was not something that could be explained away quietly. It was scale. The reaction spread through the room in layers. First confusion, then recognition, then distance. People began stepping back without being told to. Not dramatically, just enough to create space between themselves and the center of the situation. That is how social separation happens in real time. Vanessa tried to move again, not toward the exit, toward control. "This is not the place for this," she said, her voice tighter now. "Whatever this is, we can resolve it privately." The agent shook his head once. "This is already beyond private resolution." That was the point where resistance shifted into something else. Not acceptance. Not yet. But the understanding that the structure she had relied on was no longer available to her. She looked at me then. Not quickly. Not by accident. Directly. That was the first time in the entire sequence that her focus was not on managing the room, or the agents, or Liam. It was on me. "You knew," she said. It was not a question. I did not respond immediately. Not because I needed time, but because the moment did not require explanation. Everything that needed to be understood was already happening around us. "Yes," I said. That single word did more than any explanation could have. For her, it meant the system had not failed randomly. It had been identified, tracked, allowed to continue. For everyone else in the room, it meant the situation had context they had not seen. That this was not sudden. It had been building. Vanessa's expression changed again. Not to panic. To something closer to recognition. Not of the situation. Of the structure. Because in that moment, she understood something the rest of the room did not. She was not the only one being exposed. The agents did not ask her to argue. They did not ask her to explain. They asked her to move. She hesitated for less than a second, then stepped down from the stage. Not because she agreed, but because there was no version of the situation where refusing would improve her position. Liam stepped back as she moved. Not dramatically, just enough to create separation. That distance mattered. Not physically, symbolically. The agents guided her toward the exit, maintaining control without escalating the scene. Guests watched, but no one intervened. There was nothing to intervene in. The decision had already been made before anyone in that room realized it was happening. As she passed me, she slowed slightly. Not enough to stop, just enough to say one more thing. "You think this ends with me," she said quietly. It was not a threat. It was a statement. I met her gaze. "I know it doesn't," I said. And that was the truth. Because what had just been shut down in that room was not the entire system. It was only the part that had been using me. After Vanessa was escorted out, the room did not return to normal. It reorganized. That is the difference. People did not go back to celebrating. They adjusted to a new understanding of what they had just witnessed. The music did not resume immediately. No one told the band to stop, but no one told them to continue either. Conversations restarted in fragments. Quiet. Controlled. People asked each other what they thought had happened, not because they expected answers, but because they needed to confirm that what they saw was real. Liam remained where he was for a few seconds after she left. He did not follow her. He did not speak. He stood still, looking at the space she had just occupied, then down at his phone again. That sequence repeated twice. Look up. Look down. As if the information on the screen might change if he checked it again. I did not approach him immediately. That moment was not about me. It was about him aligning two versions of reality that no longer matched. Eventually, he moved. Not toward the exit. Toward me. "What did they mean by 58 million?" he asked. His voice was steady, but the structure underneath it was not. "It means the accounts connected to her activity were part of something larger," I said. "Not just personal transfers. A network." He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He listened in a way that people only do when they realize they have been missing information for a long time. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. That was not reassurance. It was acknowledgement. There is a difference. My parents approached next. Not together at first. My mother moved faster. My father followed more slowly, as if he was still processing what had happened before deciding how to respond to it. "Mara," my mother said, "what is going on?" She was not asking about the scene. She was asking about everything that led to it. I answered the same way I had answered Liam. Not with emotion. With structure. "There has been unauthorized activity linked to my accounts for some time," I said. "It connects to external entities. They've been tracking it." My father's reaction was different. He did not ask questions immediately. He looked at the room, then at me, then toward the exit where Vanessa had been taken. "This has been happening for how long?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. That answer was not precise, but it was accurate. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to realization. Not of the details, but of the pattern. She had seen parts of it before. The arguments. The tension. The comments that never felt resolved. "You should have told us," she said. That sentence is predictable. It appears in situations where people recognize a problem after it becomes visible. "I did," I said. "Not like this. But I did." She did not respond immediately. That pause mattered. It was the first time she did not move to correct or redirect what I said. My father nodded once. Not in agreement. In acceptance of something he could not change. "We'll deal with this," he said. That statement was about control. About restoring order. It was also incomplete. "It's already being dealt with," I replied. The distinction was important. This was not something the family could resolve internally. That phase had passed. Around us, the room continued to adjust. Some guests left quietly. Others stayed, not out of curiosity, but because they did not know what leaving would mean in that moment. The venue staff began. Resetting small details. Clearing glasses. Adjusting tables. Maintaining the appearance of normal operation even though the event had fundamentally changed. That is how environments respond to disruption. They attempt to restore function even when the context has shifted. Liam stepped back from the conversation. Not abruptly. Gradually. He moved toward a table, sat down, and placed his phone in front of him without touching it. He was not part of the system that had been exposed, but he had been inside its effects. That position takes time to understand. I did not follow him. Not because I did not care, but because there was nothing I could say that would accelerate that process. The agents did not return to the room. Their role inside the venue was complete. The rest of the operation continued elsewhere. Interviews. Processing. Actions that did not require public visibility. For the people still present, the event was over. For the system that had just been interrupted, it was not. I stepped outside for the first time since the sequence began. The air was quieter, cooler, removed from the controlled environment inside. One of the agents was there, positioned near the entrance, but not blocking it. He acknowledged me with a slight nod. "It went as expected," he said. That was not a statement of success. It was a confirmation of alignment between plan and execution. "Is it contained?" I asked. "For now," he said. "The primary pathways are closed. We'll know more once everything is processed." That answer was also precise. Not reassuring. Accurate. I looked back through the glass doors at the room inside. The same space. The same people. Different context. For them, the story had just reached its peak. For me, it had shifted into something else. Because what had been exposed in that room was only one layer of a system that did not depend on a single person to function. And shutting down one entry point does not guarantee the rest disappears. It only proves that it exists. The days after the wedding did not feel dramatic. That is something people do not expect. They think everything changes instantly once the truth is exposed. In reality, it unfolds in stages. Quiet ones. Administrative ones. Conversations that carry more weight than the event itself. I did not go back to work immediately. Not because I could not, but because my time was redirected. Meetings with my lawyer. Follow-up conversations with the agents. Clarifying timelines. Verifying details that seemed minor at the time, but mattered when placed into a larger structure. What they had shut down at the wedding was confirmed within 48 hours. The primary pathways connected to my accounts were frozen. The flows had stopped. But as expected, that was only one section of the system. Crestline did not disappear. It fragmented. Entities that had been linked began separating. Records updated. Names changed. Activities shifted into layers that were harder to follow without direct access. That is how systems like this respond when exposed. They do not collapse completely. They adapt. The agents explained that part clearly. "Think of it like pressure," one of them said. "You block one path, it moves somewhere else. The goal is not just to stop it in one place. It is to understand how it moves." That meant the investigation was still active. Expanding, not closing. Vanessa was no longer part of my daily life at that point. Not physically, but she was not gone from the situation either. She was being processed through a system that does not move quickly, but does not stop once it starts. I did not speak to her directly. There was no reason to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the moment she looked at me and realized I knew. But I did hear from her. Not immediately. A few days later. It came through my lawyer. A message, not a conversation. Short. Structured. She wants to explain. I did not respond right away. Not because I needed time to think, but because I needed to decide what value that explanation would have. Explanations after exposure are rarely about clarity. They are about control. About reshaping the narrative after it has already shifted. I asked one question in return. Is she asking to explain what she did, or why she did it? The answer came back quickly. Why? That told me everything I needed to know. I declined. Not because I did not want to understand, but because I already understood enough. The structure, the behavior, the decisions. The why would not change any of that. My parents handled it differently. They tried to stay involved. Not in the investigation, but in the situation itself. They wanted updates. They wanted to know what would happen next. They wanted to understand how something like this could exist inside their own family without them seeing it. That last part is the one that matters. How did we not know? My mother asked. She did not mean it defensively. She meant it as a question about awareness. You saw parts of it, I said. Just not together. That is how these things remain hidden. Not by being invisible, but by being distributed. Each piece looks small, manageable, easy to explain. It is only when you connect them that they become something else. My father did not ask as many questions. He listened more. That was new. Not because he had not cared before, but because he had not needed to listen in the same way. I should have paid more attention, he said at one point. That statement was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said during the entire situation. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged the gap between what was visible and what was understood. Liam reached out once. Not to defend Vanessa. Not to explain himself. Just to confirm something. Was I part of it, he asked. No, I said. You were adjacent to it. That distinction matters. Being inside a system and being used by it are not the same thing. He accepted that answer without pushing further. That told me he had already started processing his own version of the situation. As for me, the most noticeable change was not external. It was internal. For years, I had operated under an assumption that being reliable meant being responsible for maintaining stability in every situation, fixing problems, absorbing impact, keeping things from escalating. That assumption does not hold when the problem is structural. You cannot stabilize something that is designed to use your stability against you. That is the lesson that stays after everything else settles. Not the event, not the exposure, the pattern behind it. The investigation continued, quietly, expanding through channels I was no longer directly involved in. My role reduced over time, which was expected. Once the entry point is secured and the initial structure is mapped, the process moves beyond the individual case. From the outside, it might have looked like everything was over after the wedding. From the inside, it was just the point where the visible part ended and the rest continued without an audience. And that is the part most people never see. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something. If the person who hurt you was someone you trusted for years, would you have waited, or would you have walked away the moment something felt wrong? Because for me, the answer was not simple. It never is when it is family. After everything settled, the silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not avoidance anymore. It was space. The kind of space that forces people to sit with what actually happened instead of covering it with routine. I went back to work a week later. Same desk, same records, same systems. On the surface, nothing had changed, but the way I moved through it did. I was no longer trying to prove that everything was stable. I was making sure I understood what was real. That difference matters more than it sounds. My accounts were secured. The pathways that had been used were closed. The structures connected to me were no longer active. From a technical perspective, I was protected. But protection is not the same as resolution. Vanessa's case moved forward through the system. I did not follow every detail. I chose not to. There is a point where knowing more does not give you more control. It only keeps you attached to something you have already stepped away from. I heard enough to understand the outcome. Charges filed. Evidence confirmed. Connections established beyond just my situation. What stayed with me was not the legal result. It was the last message I received. Not directly. Through my lawyer again. This time, it was not a request to explain. It was a statement. I did not think you would see it. That sentence is more honest than anything else that was said. Not an apology. Not a justification. Just a recognition of what she had assumed about me. That I would not look closely. That I would not connect the details. That I would keep playing the role I had always played. For a long time, I did. That is the part one had to accept. Not that she used me, but that I made it easy for her to do it by staying in a position where I absorbed everything without questioning the structure behind it. My relationship with my parents changed after that. Not suddenly, not completely, but it changed. They listened more. That was the first difference. Not just to what I said, but to what I meant. They stopped translating my words into something easier to manage. They let them stay as they were. That does not fix the past, but it changes what happens next. We do not see Vanessa anymore. Not because of a decision we made together, but because there is no version of contact that would not repeat the same pattern in a different form. Some distances are not emotional. They are structural. Liam moved on. Quietly. I saw him once, months later, by accident. We did not talk about what happened. We did not need to. There are situations where shared understanding replaces conversation. As for me, the biggest change was not in what I did. It was in what I stopped doing. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided how they saw me. I stopped correcting narratives that were built to dismiss me. I stopped offering access where it was not respected. And I stopped believing that being needed was the same as being valued. That last one takes longer to learn than it should. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about money. It is not about fraud. It is not even about betrayal in the way people usually define it. It is about patterns. The small ones you ignore because they are inconvenient. The repeated ones you excuse because they come from people you trust. The structural ones that only become visible when you stop focusing on individual moments and start looking at how they connect. Everything that happened to me was built slowly. Over time, through access I allowed and behaviors I accepted, and everything that stopped it started the same way, by paying attention. If you have ever felt like something was off, but could not explain why, do not ignore that. You do not need to accuse. You do not need to react immediately, but you do need to observe, to document, to understand before you decide what to do. Because once you see the pattern clearly, the decision becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. For me, that clarity came too late to prevent everything, but it came early enough to stop it from continuing. And that is the difference between losing control and taking it back. So I will ask you again, if you were in my position, would you have waited until you had proof? Or would you have walked away the moment something felt wrong? Tell me what you would have done. And if you want more stories like this, follow and stay with me. Because not every story ends the same way, but they all start with something small that people choose to ignore.